My name is Gemma Stone. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my life, people have described me with words that sound polite but feel small, steady, practical, easygoing, the kind of woman who keeps things running but never needs the spotlight. I work as a property compliance consultant in Portland, Oregon. It's not glamorous, it's not loud, it's mostly paperwork, deadlines, and making sure other people don't cut corners they'll regret later. Most people assume I'm soft because I don't interrupt, because I don't raise my voice, because when someone makes a decision without asking me, I don't immediately correct them. They mistake restraint for permission. About 3 years ago, my younger brother called me in a panic. He needed a place to stay, just for a few weeks, he said, maybe a month. He'd hit a rough patch, a breakup, a lease ending sooner than expected, a new job not starting as quickly as promised. It sounded temporary, it sounded reasonable, so I opened my door. What I didn't realize at the time was that temporary is a word that stretches, it bends, it reshapes itself to suit the person who needs it most. Weeks become months. Gratitude turns into familiarity. Familiarity turns into assumption, and assumption turns into entitlement. Somewhere along the way, my home stopped feeling like mine. This isn't a story about screaming matches or dramatic showdowns. There were no slammed doors, no ultimatums delivered across the kitchen table, no explosive family group chats. It was quieter than that. It was about small comments that lingered longer than they should, about furniture rearranged without asking, about bills split in ways that somehow always favored him, about guests invited into my living room as if it were a shared college apartment instead of the house I had spent 10 years saving for. And eventually, it became about something far more fundamental. Ownership, not just of property but of space, of identity, of how others define your role in their lives. He forgot whose name was on the deed. And I let him forget for a while. This is the story of what happens when silence stops being compliance and starts becoming strategy, of how someone underestimated as the stable one quietly reclaims what was always hers, not with revenge, not with humiliation, but with clarity. Because sometimes the strongest move isn't raising your voice. It's letting someone walk confidently toward a door that only you have the key to. Have you ever stayed quiet long enough that people assumed you would never speak at all? If you asked my family to describe me, they'd say I was the dependable one. Not in a celebratory way, more like a structural fact, like the foundation of a house necessary, stable, but rarely admired. Growing up, I was the older sister who remembered deadlines, the one who filled out forms correctly, the one who reads contracts before signing them. My brother, Caleb, was the charming one, the risk-taker, the storyteller. When he walked into a room, conversations shifted toward him naturally. When I walked in, people handed me logistics. Even now, at 36, that dynamic hadn't changed much. Caleb was 32 when he moved in temporarily. He arrived with 2 suitcases, a confident smile, and a reassurance that this was just a short reset. He hugged me in the driveway and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you, Gem." It sounded like gratitude. Looking back, it was an expectation. At first, everyone praised me. My aunt called me generous. My mother told her friends how lucky Caleb was to have a sister with a good head on her shoulders. No one asked how I felt about rearranging my life. It was simply assumed that I would help, because that's what I do. At family gatherings, I've always been introduced as Gemma. She owns her own place. It's said with mild surprise, as if stability is an unusual hobby I picked up accidentally. When Caleb talked about his startup ideas, people leaned in. When I mentioned property tax adjustments or zoning compliance, eyes glazed over politely. I don't resent that. It's just the pattern. In my own home, the pattern followed. The first week, Caleb treated it like a guest stay. He asked before using things. He thanked me for dinner. He made a show of cleaning the kitchen. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone shifted. The hallway console table I'd chosen carefully after weeks of searching was moved to open up the space. My neutral-toned throw pillows were replaced with brighter ones, he said, which felt more alive. Packages began arriving addressed to him not as a temporary guest, but as if this were a permanent mailing address. He started saying when referring to the house, we should repaint the living room. We might want to upgrade the fridge. We need better Wi-Fi. I noticed it immediately, but I also noticed something else no one else did. When friends visited, he gave them tours. He told the story of the backyard renovation as if he'd been there during the savings years. I would be standing a few feet away, listening to him narrate my life with effortless confidence. And I would smile, not because I agreed, but because correcting him would have felt impolite, petty, overly sensitive. That's who I was to them, the woman who absorbs discomfort so others don't have to feel it. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself he just needed time to stabilize. I told myself that being generous didn't require being acknowledged. But there's a quiet difference between generosity and erasure, and I was beginning to feel the edges of it. Not in dramatic ways, just in small, almost invisible shifts, the kind that only the homeowner notices. The first moment wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voice, no line crossed so obviously that I could point to it and say, there, that's where it changed. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. Rain pressed softly against the kitchen windows, the kind that makes the house feel smaller and warmer at the same time. I had just finished reviewing a compliance report for a client and was making tea when Caleb walked in with his phone pressed to his ear. Yeah, man, it's a great place, he was saying. Plenty of space. We've got a spare room you can crash in this weekend. I paused. I stood very still, the kettle humming behind me. He leaned against my counter and continued. Yeah, I'll send you the address. Parking's easy. Just pull into the driveway. He didn't look at me. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't ask. He ended the call and smiled. Hey, my friend Marcus is coming into town, just for the weekend. You won't even notice he's here. The sentence was light, casual, pre-packaged with reassurance. You won't even notice. I remember setting my mug down carefully. This weekend I asked. Yeah, he needed a place. It's only 2 nights. Only, I calculated automatically. Guest linens, bathroom access, my Saturday morning routine, the quiet I guard carefully after a long work week. I wasn't opposed to guests. I just prefer consent. You probably should have checked with me first, I said, evenly. He blinked, genuinely confused. I mean, it's not a big deal. Gem, it's just Marcus. That was the first small cut, not the guest. The assumption, the idea that my consent was a formality, not a necessity. I watched him for a moment. There was no malice in his face, no smirk, no deliberate defiance, just certainty. The certainty of someone who doesn't question his own right to space. And suddenly I understood something subtle but important. In his mind, he hadn't overstepped. In his mind, we lived here. I considered pushing harder. I considered saying no. I imagined the slight shift in atmosphere, the disappointment, the implication that I was being rigid. So I did what I've always done. I adjusted. 2 nights, I said. And please give me notice next time. Of course, he replied quickly, already halfway back to his room. But he didn't register the boundary. I could see it. The conversation slid off him like rain off glass. That weekend, Marcus arrived with a duffel bag and loud laughter. Caleb gave him the grand tour again. I overheard phrases like, we redid the backyard last spring, and we're thinking of opening up this wall eventually. I stood at the sink, rinsing dishes, listening to my life being pluralized. No one meant harm. That's what made it complicated. Marcus thanked me for hosting. Caleb thanked me too in front of him, performatively, as if acknowledging me once restored balance. But something had shifted inside me. It wasn't anger. It was documentation. A quiet mental note. Not about the guest, not about the inconvenience. About language. About ownership slowly dissolving into a shared narrative. The following Monday, after they both left for coffee, I walked through the house alone. The cushions were indented differently. The guest's towel was damp. A chair had been dragged slightly out of place. These were tiny things, normal things. But I realized something as I stood in the living room. I had felt like a visitor in my own home. That realization didn't explode. It settled. And once it settled, it didn't leave. The first small cut rarely bleeds dramatically. It just marks the skin so quietly that everyone else insists there's nothing there. But you remember it. Always. After that weekend, nothing outwardly worsened. Which, in some ways, made it easier to ignore. Caleb didn't throw parties. He didn't damage anything. He paid me something he called rent. though it was less than half the market rate and arrived inconsistently, usually after a reminder that I phrased as gently as possible. On the surface, it was functional. But patterns don't announce themselves. They accumulate. The next shift came through tone. He began correcting me in small, almost playful ways. When I reminded him to let me know before inviting guests, he laughed lightly and said, "You're so formal about everything." When I asked him to keep his work calls in his room after 9 p.m., he replied, "You worry too much. It's fine." It's fine. That phrase began to follow me through my own house. If a package of his blocked the hallway, it was fine. If he left the porch light on all night, it was fine. If he suggested rearranging the garage to make it more efficient, it was fine. Each time, I weighed whether the discomfort was worth addressing. Each time, I chose peace. I told myself he's going through a transition. I told myself it's temporary. I told myself you don't need to be territorial. But something subtle was happening. He stopped knocking before entering my office. At first, it was quick interruptions. "Hey, do we have printer paper?" Then it became casual, leaning against the doorframe while I was mid-meeting, whispering questions as if my work were flexible background noise. One afternoon, while I was on a video call with a municipal client, he walked behind my camera frame to grab a book from the shelf. No apology, no hesitation, just presence. Afterward, I closed the door and sat very still. It wasn't the interruption itself. It was the assumption that my boundaries were adjustable. When I brought it up that evening, carefully and calmly, he sighed. "Gem, you're acting like I'm some kind of intruder." The word lingered. Intruder. I almost laughed at the irony, but instead, I felt something else, a familiar pressure, the lifelong reflex to soften, to reassure. "I'm not saying that," I replied. "I just need privacy when I'm working." He nodded, but the nod felt like compliance, not comprehension. And slowly, I noticed a shift in how others responded to me. At a family dinner, my mother asked Caleb how the house was working out for you two. "For you two?" I smiled automatically. Caleb answered confidently, "It's been great. We're figuring things out." I watched my mother beam at the idea of shared sibling harmony. I realized in that moment that correcting the language would make me look territorial, ungenerous. So I let it pass. That's how normalization happens. Not through dramatic violations, but through the steady erosion of specificity. My house became our place. My office became the shared workspace. My routines became rigid preferences, and my silence became confirmation. What bothered me most wasn't Caleb's behavior. It was how easily everyone accepted the new narrative. Even me. I began adjusting unconsciously, planning my showers around his mornings, scheduling calls when I knew he'd be out, asking before hosting my own friends, because I didn't want to inconvenience him. That was the moment I understood the depth of it. I was negotiating space in a home that legally, financially, and structurally belonged to me. But legality isn't the same as psychological ownership. And psychologically, I was receding. Not dramatically, just incrementally. There's a particular kind of disrespect that doesn't look like cruelty. It looks like comfort, familiarity, casual entitlement. It's the kind that makes you question whether you're overreacting, so you stay quiet. And quiet, repeated long enough, becomes invisible. There's a moment subtle, almost unremarkable when you realize you've been cast in a role you never auditioned for. For me, it happened on a Sunday afternoon while folding laundry. Caleb was in the living room with two friends. I hadn't known they were coming over. I'd learned to expect that. Their laughter drifted down the hallway, easy and relaxed, as this house had always belonged to him. I carried a basket of warm towels toward the linen closet when I heard one of them say, "Man, you landed on your feet. This place is solid." Caleb chuckled. "Yeah, it worked out. Worked out. Not Gemma worked 10 years for this. Not my sister bought this on her own. Just worked out." I paused outside the hallway, unseen, waiting, almost foolishly, for clarification. It didn't come. Instead, one of them asked, "So how long are you staying?" There was a brief silence. Then Caleb answered, "Honestly, I'm not in a rush." Something inside me shifted not sharply, but definitively. Not in a rush. I realized then that my timeline and his timeline were no longer aligned. What I viewed as temporary support, he viewed as open-ended stability. And the role I had been assigned became clearer. I wasn't the homeowner. I wasn't even the sister. I was the stabilizer, the infrastructure, the quiet constant that allowed him to experiment with his next move. Later that evening, after his friends left, he walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. "We're almost out of milk," he said casually. "Can you grab some tomorrow?" "Could you?" "Not. I'll pick some up." "Just can you?" The assumption was small, domestic, easy to dismiss. But it carried something deeper. I had become the household manager. Bills were automatically my responsibility. Maintenance schedules were mine. Property tax notices, insurance renewals, plumbing checks, invisible tasks that sustain a home but rarely receive acknowledgement. He enjoyed the space. I sustained it. And because I did it quietly, it appeared effortless. That's the danger of competence. When you carry things well, people forget they're heavy. A week later, I overheard him on another call. "Yeah, it's basically our place. My sister handles the boring paperwork stuff." The boring paperwork stuff? I stood in my office, looking at the neatly labelled folders inside my black leather portfolio, the deed, inspection reports, escrow records, tax documentation. Every signature on those pages was mine. Every risk had been mine. Every payment had come from my account. Boring paperwork? I didn't confront him. Instead, I asked myself a more important question. When did I start accepting this framing? Because here's the truth, no one formally demoted me. There wasn't a meeting where I agreed to step down from ownership. It happened gradually, through language, through convenience, through my own reluctance to disrupt harmony. I had always been proud of being steady, of being the calm one, of not escalating small things into larger conflicts. But I began to see how that trait had been interpreted, not as a strength, as availability. There's a specific kind of invisibility that comes from being useful. You are valued, yes, but functionally, like a reliable appliance. No one thanks the foundation for holding up the house. They only notice when it cracks. That night, I sat at the dining table alone. The overhead light cast a soft circle around the wood surface I had refinished myself years ago. I looked around the room. The furniture I chose, the mortgage I qualified for alone, the quiet life I built deliberately. And I realized something with unsettling clarity. I had been slowly stepping aside inside my own home. Not because I lacked power, but because I didn't want to appear controlling. And in doing so, I had allowed someone else to feel in control. The role assigned to me was comfortable, but it wasn't accurate. And once you see the role clearly, you can't unsee it. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen after a particularly bold overstep. It happened on a quiet Wednesday morning, in complete silence. Caleb had left early. The house was still. Pale winter light filtered through the kitchen windows, catching the edges of dust in the air. I was standing at the sink, hands resting lightly on the counter, looking out at the backyard. And for the first time in months, I felt alone in my own house. Not physically alone, but emotionally returned. There's a difference. When someone occupies your space long enough, even their absence feels structured around them. You move through rooms with awareness. You consider their schedule, their preferences, their possible reactions. But that morning, I noticed something unusual. I wasn't calculating. I wasn't adjusting. I was just standing there. I made coffee slowly, sat at the dining table, opened my black leather portfolio, not because I needed to, but because it grounded me. The deed rested in its protective sleeve. My name printed clearly, formally, undeniably. Gemma Stone, sole owner. The words didn't feel triumphant. They felt clarified. I thought back to the past few months, the language shifts, the small assumptions, the normalization of we. None of it had been aggressive. None of it was dramatic enough to justify outrage. But clarity doesn't require drama. It requires contrast. And in that quiet kitchen, I saw the contrast clearly for the first time. I had been acting like a host afraid to inconvenience a guest. In a house that legally, financially, and ethically belonged to me, that realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Anger demands a reaction. Precision demands patience. I began replaying conversations in my mind, not emotionally, but analytically. Where had I softened? Where had I defaulted to reassurance? Where had I used phrases like, "It's okay," when it wasn't? I noticed a pattern in myself that was older than this house. I avoided conflict not because I was afraid, but because I disliked inefficiency. Emotional escalation wastes time. It clouds facts. It invites unnecessary noise. But avoidance, I realized, creates a different kind of inefficiency. It invites reinterpretation. By midday, something had settled inside me. I wasn't going to confront Caleb with a list of grievances. I wasn't going to suddenly assert authority in a way that felt foreign or theatrical. I was going to stop participating in the illusion. That was the shift. Not louder, clearer. When he came home that evening, he launched into a story about a new opportunity, a possible collaboration, a potential investor, timelines still uncertain. Normally, I would have nodded encouragingly, asked questions, offered feedback. Instead, I listened quietly, not detached, just observant. When he said, "If this works out, we might need to rethink the office space," I didn't correct him. I didn't challenge the we. I simply asked, evenly, "What's your projected timeline for moving out?" The air changed. Not dramatically, just enough. He blinked, slightly thrown. Moving out. Yes, I said, calm. You mentioned this was temporary. I'm trying to plan. There was no accusation in my voice, no edge. Just logistics. He hesitated, the first real hesitation I'd seen in months. I mean, I don't know yet. I thought we were just taking it month by month. We were not. But I didn't argue. I nodded once. I need a clearer time frame. That was all. No lecture. No emotion. Just clarity was introduced into a space that had grown comfortable with ambiguity. He looked mildly unsettled, not angry, not defensive, just recalibrating. And I understood something in that moment. He hadn't forgotten the arrangement maliciously. He had forgotten it conveniently. There's a difference. That night, as I locked the front door, I felt something steady return to me. Not control, authority. Quiet, documented, indisputable authority. The shift wasn't visible, but it was permanent. After that evening, I didn't change my tone. I changed my participation. There's a subtle difference between silence born from discomfort and silence chosen with intention. For months, mine had been the first kind, the reflexive quiet that smooths tension before it forms. Now, it has become the second. Deliberate, observant, measured. Caleb noticed something, though he couldn't quite name it. When he said we about the house, I no longer smiled in agreement. I didn't correct him either. I simply didn't reinforce it. No nod, no affirmation, just neutral acknowledgement. Language without echo begins to sound different. He started testing the edges again, small suggestions about reorganizing the garage, replacing a light fixture, repainting the guest room to make it more current. Before, I would have explained my reasoning. Softened the refusal with apologies. I just prefer it this way. Maybe later. We'll see. Now, my answers were shorter. No. Or, that won't be necessary. Delivered calmly, without explanation. The first time I said it, just, no. He stared at me as if waiting for the rest of the sentence. It didn't come. What do you mean? He asked lightly. I mean, no, I replied evenly. Silence lingered in the kitchen for a few seconds longer than usual. Not hostile, just unfamiliar. He laughed softly, trying to reframe it. Okay, someone's strict. I didn't defend myself. Silence again. It's interesting how quickly people interpret restraint as weakness until the restraint removes itself. He began filling the space with more words, justifications, explanations, casual persuasion. I stopped debating. Instead, I asked questions. When do you see yourself signing your next lease? Have you started looking at apartments yet? What's your savings target? Each question was practical, unemotional, framed as planning. But planning implies an endpoint, and endpoints had never been clearly defined between us. He began answering vaguely. Soon, I'm exploring options. It depends on how things go. I documented nothing overtly. I didn't announce boundaries, but internally, I was gathering clarity. One evening, he invited another friend over without mentioning it first. When I came home to unfamiliar shoes by the door, I didn't confront him in front of the guest. I waited. After they left, I stood in the living room and said, calmly, going forward, I need 48 hours notice before anyone stays here. He looked mildly annoyed. It was just one night. I understand. I said 48 hours. No argument, no raised voice. He studied my face as if trying to detect anger. There wasn't any, only certainty. He shrugged. Fine. But something had shifted in the power dynamic. Not because I became louder, because I became immovable, and immovability unsettles people who rely on flexibility. Over the next few weeks, I noticed his energy change, less expansive, more cautious. He stopped giving elaborate tours of the house to visitors. He referred to it occasionally as Gemma's place again casually, but noticeably. Not consistently, but enough. Silence, when strategic, creates space for others to hear themselves. I didn't threaten eviction. I didn't reference the deed. I simply stopped behaving like a co-tenant, and in doing so, I began to feel the psychological structure of the house reassemble around its original center. Me? He mistook my calm for patience. He mistook my restraint for continued accommodation. He didn't realize that silence had stopped being surrender. It had become positioning. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed when mine began. I didn't announce a plan. I didn't draft ultimatums or rehearse speeches in the mirror. I simply returned to something that has always steadied me: documentation. If there is one thing my profession has taught me, it's this: clarity is built on paper. One Saturday morning, while Caleb was out meeting a friend, I sat at the dining table with my black leather portfolio open beside my laptop. I wasn't reacting, I was organizing. First, I reviewed the original terms of his stay. There hadn't been a formal written agreement, just a text exchange from months ago. Just a few weeks, I promise. Of course, we'll reassess in a month. Reassess? We never did. I screenshotted the conversation and saved it in a folder labeled simply House Internal. Not accusatory, not emotional, just precise. Then I reviewed the financial transfers he'd made. I exported the payment history, dates, amounts, gaps. I didn't interpret them, I just logged them. Patterns reveal themselves without commentary. Next, I looked at local tenancy laws. Not because I wanted a confrontation, but because I needed information. Duration of stay, residency classification, notice requirements, documentation standards. Knowledge removes ambiguity. Ambiguity favors the person most comfortable stretching it. I wasn't angry at Caleb. That's important. I didn't view him as an adversary, but I began viewing the situation as a structure. And structures require definition. Over the following weeks, I made small logistical adjustments he didn't notice. I separated household expenses clearly. Utilities were recalculated based on actual usage averages. I created a shared expense spreadsheet: neutral, factual, automatically updated. When I sent him the link, I kept the message simple. Going forward, we'll track shared costs here for clarity. He responded with a thumbs up emoji. No resistance. But also, no awareness of the broader shift. I scheduled a consultation with a housing attorney not to initiate action, but to understand thresholds. I asked questions hypothetically. If a family member stays beyond the originally stated timeframe, what constitutes implied tenancy? What notice period is legally sound? The attorney's answers were calm and procedural. Nothing dramatic, no courtroom theatrics. Just timelines, documentation, notice requirements. I wrote everything down. Back home, nothing looked different. I still made tea in the evenings. We still had occasional light conversations about work. From the outside, we were siblings sharing space peacefully. But internally, I stopped thinking in terms of feelings. I started thinking in terms of exit strategies. Not his, mine. What would the cleanest resolution look like? What timeline felt reasonable? What documentation would make that timeline enforceable? There's a misconception that power announces itself loudly. It doesn't. Real power often looks like quiet preparation. Meanwhile, Caleb grew more comfortable again. My calmness reassured him. My lack of visible frustration signaled stability. He began making longer-term comments again. If I'm still here by summer, when we upgrade the patio furniture, I didn't correct him. I noted it. One evening, while he was out, I walked through the house slowly. The living room, the office, the hallway. He no longer knocked before entering, though now he hesitated slightly. I imagined the space fully mine again, not in anger, in clarity. I wasn't fantasizing about reclaiming territory. I was recalibrating it. What he never noticed was that my silence no longer meant tolerance. It meant timing, and timing, once chosen deliberately, becomes its own form of leverage. The moment of leverage didn't arrive like a revelation. It arrived like confirmation. It was a Thursday afternoon when I received an email from my mortgage lender, a routine annual statement. I almost achieved it without opening. Instead, I clicked. The balance, the payment history, the equity growth over the past 3 years, numbers don't dramatize. They clarify. I stared at the screen for a long moment, absorbing something I had always known but hadn't fully contextualized. This house was not just mine. Legally, it was mine structurally, financially, indisputably. Every improvement, every tax payment, every repair invoice. My name, my credit, my liability, my asset. And then something subtle aligned in my mind. Caleb had begun forwarding mail here months ago. Bank correspondence, subscription services, even voter registration, without ever formally discussing it. If he stayed long enough, if the arrangement remained undefined, ambiguity could evolve into assumption. Not legal ownership, but residency, tenancy, complication. I opened the folder I had created weeks earlier. I reviewed dates, length of stay, payment inconsistencies, text confirmations. Then I opened the local housing statute summary that the attorney had referenced. 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Thresholds? I felt no surge of triumph. Just clarity. He hadn't overpowered me. He had relied on my discomfort with friction. That was the leverage, and it belonged to me. Because friction, introduced calmly and lawfully, shifts everything. That evening, Caleb came home energized. He had good news, or at least promising news. A potential partnership is progressing, meetings scheduled. This could change everything, he said, pacing slightly. If it lands, I might not need to rush anything. Rush anything. I watched him as he spoke. He believed time favored him. He believed stability was indefinite. He believed my quiet meant extension. He forgot something fundamental. This wasn't shared uncertainty. It was my structure, my timeline, my property. And suddenly, the imbalance felt less emotional and more procedural. Later that night, when the house was quiet, I drafted a document. Not a threat, not an eviction notice. A formalized occupancy agreement backdated only to the present month, clearly outlining monthly contribution amount, aligned with market-adjusted shared expense value, defined end date, 6 weeks forward, acknowledgement of non-tenant status, 30-day written notice requirement, if extension requested, clear statement of sole property ownership. The language was neutral, professional, unemotional. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop. I didn't present it immediately, because leverage doesn't require immediate use. It requires timing. The private reveal wasn't something I told him. It was something I understood fully for the first time. He could feel comfortable. He could speak in we. He could postpone decisions. But legally, structurally, and procedurally, he was temporary, and I had documentation to ensure it stayed that way. For months, I had felt like I was negotiating psychologically. Now I realized something steady and grounding. There was nothing to negotiate. He had mistaken access for authority, and access can be revised. Quietly, without spectacle, without anger, without revenge. I didn't feel powerful. I felt anchored, and anchored people don't rush. They wait for the precise moment the tide shifts. Clarity creates options, and options demand a decision. For several days after drafting the occupancy agreement, I carried it in my leather portfolio, not as a weapon, not even as a plan, just as a tangible reminder that ambiguity was no longer running the situation. I considered my choices carefully. Option 1. Continue as we were, maintain quiet boundaries, hope his new opportunity accelerates his departure organically. Option 2. Initiate a direct conversation, formalize expectations, and risk tension. Option 3. Issue a formal notice immediately and let the structure of law replace the structure of sibling understanding. Each path led somewhere different. The first preserved comfort but extended uncertainty. The second required emotional steadiness but a preserved relationship if handled well. The third was clean, decisive, and irreversible. For a long time, I would have chosen option 1. Not because it was best, but because it was easiest socially. But something had changed in me. I realized the cost of comfort had been self-erasure, and that was no longer acceptable. The decision point arrived on an ordinary evening. Caleb was in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone, half listening to music. I was reviewing emails at the table. He looked up and said casually, "Hey, my friend Tara might need a place for a couple of weeks. I told her we could probably make it work." Probably. Make it work. I felt the air shift not sharply, but definitively. He had skipped past asking, skipped past assuming. Now he was extending access. Through me. Without me. That was the moment. Not because of terror, but because the pattern had matured. I closed my laptop gently. "No," I said. He looked surprised. No, that won't be happening." He frowned slightly. "Why not? It's temporary." I held his gaze evenly. So was this. Silence. A long one. He shifted his weight. "Gem, come on. You know I'm figuring things out, and I've supported that." I replied calmly. "But this house isn't an open resource. It's mine, and it needs a defined plan." The word mine landed differently this time. Not defensive. Declarative. He didn't argue immediately. He studied me, as if recalculating something he hadn't needed to calculate before. "What are you saying?" he asked finally. "I'm saying we need a clear end date." There it was. Not shouted, not dramatized, just stated. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in discomfort. Discomfort is often the first sign that clarity has entered a space built on convenience. "You're serious," he said. "Yes."
Another pause.
"How long?" I reached into my portfolio and placed the document on the table between us. "I've outlined a 6-week timeline," I said. "With clear terms, it gives you structure. It gives me certainty." He stared at the paper but didn't touch it immediately. For the first time since moving in, he looked like a guest. Not unwelcome, but temporary. This was the irreversible choice. Not because I was removing him instantly, but because I was redefining the structure formally. Once written, ambiguity doesn't return easily. He had believed time was elastic. I chose to make it measurable. He exhaled slowly and picked up the document. The tide had shifted. Not loudly, but permanently. He didn't argue that night. That surprised me more than resistance would have. Caleb read the document carefully. I watched his eyes move across the lines, the defined end date, the clarified contribution amount, the acknowledgement of sole ownership. When he finished, he placed it back on the table. "This feels formal," he said. "It is," I replied calmly. A long pause stretched between us. "You didn't talk to me about this first." "I am talking to you about it," I said, now, with clarity. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed loosely, not defensive, just unsettled. "I didn't realize it was that serious." I nodded slightly. That's part of the problem. There was no accusation in my tone, just a fact. He asked for a day to think about it. I agreed. And then I did something important. I stopped filling the silence. For months, I had softened the tension quickly, explained my reasoning, reassured him emotionally. This time, I allowed discomfort to exist. The next day, while he was out, I began moving in silence. Not emotionally, procedurally. I scheduled a locksmith consultation for the week after the 6-week end date, tentatively, not maliciously, just prepared. I contacted my insurance provider to confirm coverage requirements regarding non-tenant occupants. I reviewed utility account structures to ensure all services remained solely under my name. None of these actions was dramatic. They were preventative. Preparation is quiet. That evening, Caleb signed the agreement. He didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful, slightly disoriented. "I guess I didn't think you were keeping track like this," he admitted. "I always keep track," I said gently. And it was true. Over the following days, something subtle shifted in his behavior. He began spending more time outside the house, more phone calls, more apartment browsing tabs open on his laptop. He stopped referring to the house as ours. Language recalibrated quickly once the structure was entered. We still shared dinners occasionally. Conversations were polite, calm, but the dynamic had changed. He was no longer expanding. He was planning, and I didn't hover. I didn't monitor. I didn't remind him of the date. I simply continued my routines with quiet steadiness. One evening, he asked, "You really would have gone legal if I refused?" I looked at him evenly. I wouldn't have needed to. The structure speaks for itself. That was the truth. Authority doesn't need to threaten when it's documented. Weeks passed without conflict. From the outside, nothing seemed dramatic. No raised voices, no dramatic family fallout. But internally, the foundation had been restored. I was no longer negotiating identity inside my own home. I was simply inhabiting it. The most powerful shifts rarely look like battles. They look like logistics. And logistics, when handled calmly, leave very little room for confusion. The consequences didn't arrive as a confrontation. They arrived as an absence. Caleb started coming home later, not recklessly, just less anchored. He spent weekends touring apartments. His phone calls shifted from abstract business ideas to specific lease terms and security deposits. He wasn't angry with me, but something in him had recalibrated. When structure enters a space built on flexibility, people feel it as a loss. Not loss of affection, loss of access. One evening, he stood in the kitchen longer than usual, leaning against the counter while I prepared dinner. "You've changed," he said casually. I didn't look up immediately. "How? You're firmer." I considered that. "I'm clearer," I replied. He nodded slowly, as if testing the difference. "I didn't mean to make you feel like this wasn't your place," he added, almost defensively. "I know, I said, and I did know. That's what made this complex." He hadn't set out to displace me. He had simply grown comfortable. Comfort expands quietly, but so does accountability. Over the next 2 weeks, the house felt different. Not tense, but transitional. He began sorting his belongings. Small piles appeared in his room, boxes folded flat against the wall. The sound of packing tape one Saturday afternoon felt strangely grounding. Not triumphant, just aligned. "At a family dinner?" my mother asked casually. "How's everything at the house?" Caleb answered first. "I'm moving out next month." The table went quiet for a fraction of a second. "Oh," my mother said. "I thought things were going well." "They are," I replied calmly. "This was always temporary." The emphasis was subtle, but intentional. My aunt glanced between us. "No fight, I hope." "No fight," I said, and that was true. But there was something else, something less visible. People around us had grown used to the idea of us as a shared unit, a cooperative sibling arrangement. It made a nice story. Now that the story was adjusting, not because of drama, because of the structure, later that night, Caleb lingered in the hallway outside my office. "You didn't have to make it formal," he said quietly. "I did," I answered. He studied me for a moment. Why? Because I was disappearing? Because comfort had turned into an assumption? Because silence without structure invites reinterpretation? But I didn't say all that. I needed clarity, I said instead. He exhaled slowly. "I guess I got used to it." "Yes," I replied gently. "You did." There was no accusation in the exchange, just acknowledgement. Consequences, when delivered calmly, don't feel like punishment. They feel like gravity. You can ignore gravity for a while. You can pretend you're suspended, but eventually, structure asserts itself. And when it does, it doesn't shout. It simply holds. As the final weeks approached, I noticed something subtle in myself. I wasn't counting down days. I wasn't anticipating relief. I was steady, because this had never been about removing him. It had been about restoring balance. And balance, once re-established, feels quiet. Solid, uncomplicated. The house already felt larger. Not physically, but psychologically. And that difference mattered more than square footage ever could. The panic didn't come from me. It came from him. 3 weeks before the end date, Caleb's promising partnership stalled. An investor backed out. Timelines shifted. The apartment he had been considering was leased to someone else. I could see the recalculation happening behind his eyes. One evening, he stood in the doorway of my office knocking this time and said, "Can we talk?" I closed my laptop. Of course. He sat across from me, shoulders slightly tense. "So, things got complicated." He began. "The deal's delayed, and the apartment fell through. I might need a little more time." There it was. The return of elasticity. I folded my hands on the desk. "How much time?" I asked. "Maybe a couple of months, just until everything stabilizes." "Just stabilizes?" I held his gaze calmly. "Caleb," I said evenly, "we set a timeline." "I know," he said quickly, "and I thought I'd be ready. I just didn't expect this. Unexpected events aren't rare. Undefined boundaries are." I didn't rush my response. Silence has weight when it's intentional. This is exactly why I formalized it. I said, "Ambiguity stretches." He ran a hand through his hair. "So what are you saying? You're not willing to extend it?" There was no anger in his voice, just urgency and something else. Recognition. Recognition that the structure he once ignored was now immovable. "I'm saying the agreement stands, I replied calmly. If you need support finding a short-term rental, I'll help you research options, but the date doesn't change. The room felt very still. You're serious? He said again, softer this time. Yes. For a moment, I saw something close to frustration cross his face, not directed at me, directed at reality. I thought you'd understand, he said. I do understand, I replied. That's why I gave 6 weeks. That's when it settled over him. This wasn't reactive. It wasn't emotional. It had been decided long before tonight, and decisions made in clarity are difficult to undo. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling briefly. I guess I didn't think you'd actually hold me to it. I didn't respond immediately, because that sentence revealed everything. Not cruelty, not entitlement, assumption. He had believed my boundaries were negotiable because they had been in the past, and now they weren't. You've always been flexible, he added quietly. Yes, I said. I have. And that was the shift. Flexibility without limits invites dependency. Flexibility with structure invites respect. After a long pause, he nodded once. Okay, he said. I'll figure it out. There was no dramatic exit from the room, no slammed doors, no raised voices, just the quiet acceptance that the window had closed. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room. The house felt steady, not cold, not harsh, just defined. Sometimes people don't panic because you're unfair. They panic because they miscalculated how far your patience extended. And once patience becomes policy, it's too late to renegotiate comfort. The end date remained unchanged. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty about that. Moving day arrived without ceremony. No countdown, no dramatic farewell music playing in the background of our lives, just cardboard boxes stacked neatly near the door and the quiet rhythm of final decisions. Caleb had secured a short-term rental across town. Not ideal. He admitted, smaller, more expensive than he wanted, but available. Available is often what clarity produces. That morning, he carried the last box from his room into the hallway. The space looked unfamiliar without his things lighter, but also honest. I stood near the entryway, not supervising, not hovering, just present. When he set the final box down, he looked around the living room slowly. It feels different already, he said. It is, I replied. There was no edge in my voice. He exhaled, then glanced at me. Can I ask you something? Yes. Did you ever feel like I was trying to take over? The question wasn't defensive. It was searching. I considered it carefully. No, I said finally. I felt like you stopped noticing where you were standing. He absorbed that. I guess I did, he admitted quietly. Silence followed, but it wasn't tense. It was reflective. For what it's worth, he added. I never meant to disrespect you. I know, I said. And I did. That's what made this confrontation different from a fight. It wasn't about villain and victim. It was about boundaries and comfort. He shifted his weight, hands in his jacket pockets. When you gave me that agreement, he said, it felt cold. I understand. I replied, but it wasn't cold. It was clear. He nodded slowly. I think I mistook your quiet for permission. That's fair, I said, because in some ways, I had allowed that interpretation. Not intentionally, but consistently. He glanced toward the dining table. You always seemed fine. I wasn't upset. I clarified. I was disappearing. The words hung gently in the air. Not dramatic, not accusatory. Just true. He looked at me more directly then. I didn't see that. I know. That was the heart of it. He hadn't seen it because I had been good at absorbing it. And I had been good at absorbing it because that was the role I had practiced my whole life. Reliable, flexible, quiet. He picked up his keys from the console table, the same one he had moved months ago without asking. I appreciate what you did, he said. I know, I replied. There was nothing left to argue. No emotional explosion. No catalogue of past grievances. Just acknowledgement. He stepped toward the door, then paused. For the record, he added, with a faint half smile, I definitely forgot whose name was on the deed. I met his expression evenly. I know, I said again. But this time, there was something steady behind it. Not superiority, not triumph, just ownership. He left without slamming the door. The house settled into silence naturally, like water returning to stillness after a boat passes through. Confrontation doesn't always require heat. Sometimes it only requires clarity held long enough that everyone else adjusts around it. And in that adjustment, something fundamental changes. The first night alone felt unfamiliar, not because I was lonely, because the house was fully mine again, not legally, but psychologically. There's a difference between owning something on paper and inhabiting it without negotiation. I walked through each room slowly that evening. The guest room was empty. The office door remained exactly where I left it. The kitchen counters were undisturbed. Nothing dramatic had changed. And yet everything had, for months. I had calibrated myself around someone else's presence, adjusted noise levels, adjusted routines, adjusted expectations. Now there was no one to adjust for. I made tea and sat at the dining table, letting the quiet expand naturally. It wasn't triumphant quiet. It was aligned quietly. Over the next few weeks, small things returned. I hosted a friend for dinner without asking permission. I rearranged the living room slightly, not because it needed correction, but because I wanted to. I reclaimed the guest room as a reading space. Each decision was minor, but internally, they felt declarative. I noticed something else, too. I didn't feel angry when I thought about Caleb. I didn't replay conversations, wishing I'd said more. There was no residual bitterness. Just clarity about who I am and who I am not. I am not inflexible. I am not cold. I am not territorial. But I am defined. For most of my life, I believed strength meant endurance, absorbing discomfort gracefully, being the stable one so others could be dynamic. There's value in that. But endurance without boundaries isn't strength. It's erosion. What changed wasn't my personality. It was my threshold. I no longer equate silence with peace. Sometimes peace requires structure. I still speak calmly. I still avoid unnecessary escalation. I still believe in fairness over spectacle. But I also understand now that clarity delivered early prevents confusion later. A few weeks after he moved out, Caleb stopped by to pick up a forwarded piece of mail. He stood in the entryway, glanced around, and smiled slightly. "It feels like you again," he said. I smiled back. "It always was, and that's the truth." The house didn't change me. The situation clarified me. I'm still the woman people describe as steady. Still the one who reads contracts thoroughly. Still the one who plans ahead. But now, there's something quieter beneath that steadiness. Certainty. Not loud, not performative. Just present. I no longer worry about appearing controlling. I no longer soften statements that are already reasonable. I no longer step aside inside spaces I built. Ownership isn't about dominance, it's about alignment. And alignment doesn't require raising your voice. It requires knowing exactly where you stand and staying there. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a sharper ending. A dramatic fallout, a family divided, a triumphant moment where I won. But this was never about winning. It was about remembering whose name was on the deed, remembering who signed the mortgage, remembering who slowly stepped aside and who chose to step back in. There's a particular kind of power that doesn't shout, it doesn't humiliate, it doesn't seek revenge. It documents, it defines, it holds. For a long time, I believed kindness required flexibility without limit. That being the dependable one meant absorbing more than was fair. That keeping peace meant keeping quiet. But peace without structure becomes permission. And permission, when unspoken, gets rewritten by the most comfortable person in the room. My brother didn't move into my house intending to take over. He simply forgot. He forgot where the lines were because I stopped drawing them clearly. And when I redrew them, calmly and without anger, everything recalibrated. There were no villains here, no dramatic ultimatums. Just clarity was introduced into a space that had grown too comfortable with ambiguity. Sometimes people don't respect boundaries because they're cruel. They fail to respect them because they were never required to. The lesson wasn't about eviction. It was about ownership, not just of property, but of identity. I am still generous. I am still calm, but I am no longer invisible inside the life I built. And if there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. You don't have to explode to be firm. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to humiliate someone to hold your ground. Sometimes the strongest sentence in the room is simply, "No, so I'm curious." Have you ever stayed quiet so long that someone mistook your patience for permission?